of this. We love the idea of these believers just gathering together and loving one another and strengthening one another in their Christian life. I would say again that Christians, a fourth characteristic of how Christians met and worshiped, is that Christians were both what we would call normal and not normal. And for that idea, I want to quote to you from the letter to Diognetus by an unknown Christian. This would be about 150 to 180. And I think it shows this idea of how Christians were both normal and not normal. I love this quotation. He says, "For Christians are not distinguished from the rest of mankind in country or customs. For they do not live somewhere in cities of their own, or use some distinctive language, or practice a peculiar manner of life. Though they follow local customs in dress and food and the rest of their living, their own way of life which they display is wonderful and admittedly strange. They take part in everything like citizens and endure everything like aliens. Like everyone else they marry, they have children, but not a common bed. They remain on earth, but they're citizens of heaven." Do you understand what I mean by this? By saying that Christians were normal, but not normal, right? He says, listen, we don't have our own country, we don't have our own customs, we don't have our own cities, we don't have our own language. But yes, we follow local customs in dress and food and the rest of our living, but yet other aspects of our life are, and you love how this is, wonderful and admittedly strange, right? And that's just sort of this tension, right? They weren't like the Amish, so to speak, right? Where they were completely separated from life and culture and all this. No, not at all. But on the other hand, they weren't sold out to the world. Wouldn't you look at this and describe this perfectly as what Jesus described as being in the world, but not of the world? I have to say that in large measure, the early church fulfilled that ideal very, very well. Well, the last subject we want to cover here at the end of this very first lecture is the nature of persecution against Christians in the early church. We already touched a little bit on the idea of persecution in the Apostolic church and how that was the beginning of what we would call official or state-sponsored persecution. But here in the early church, not only was the persecution official and state-sponsored, but it was much more severe. But there's many things that people misunderstand about persecution in the early church. First of all, it's important for us to understand that persecution was never universal or constant. If you picture in your mind a map of the Roman Empire, okay, can you picture that in your mind? Think about all that land throughout the Roman Empire. There was never a time when all the Christians in all the Roman Empire were being persecuted. Now listen, some persecutions were bigger than others. Some of them were very local affairs. Some of them were much larger than local affairs. But look, there was never a time when all the Christians in all the empire were being persecuted. As well, there was also never a time, let me rephrase that. Also, we should say that persecution during this period of the early church, from 100 to 312, it came in periods. It came in waves. Sometimes in our mind, we sort of imagine 212 years of constant persecution. It wasn't like that. Persecutions would sort of ebb and flow like the tide. It would depend on who the emperor was. And then the emperor would usually delegate the job of persecution to his regional administrators, and then it would depend upon the regional administrator. So persecution was never universal or constant, and local governors had a lot of authority to determine how energetically Christians would be persecuted. Persecution could also take many different forms. You know, the most common form of persecution was not violent. The most common form of persecution was usually economic and social. Now, there were several significant periods of persecution that we should consider here. There were four major persecutions. And I say there's four major ones. There were many many smaller persecutions in between these guys. Nobody should take a look at these 4 Roman emperors and say, oh, those were the only periods of persecution. No nonsense. I don't know if any of you ever heard of or ever seen this movie, Gladiator, right? And this old Roman emperor at the beginning of the movie, what's his name? Marcus Aurelius. Well, he was a real Roman emperor. He reigned from about 161 to 181 AD. And he was regarded as one of the more enlightened emperors. Nevertheless, he commissioned a few specific persecutions, especially in the area of Lyon, France. Now, he didn't commission a widespread persecution over much of the empire, but yet, even this enlightened Roman emperor, who's not on this list, he commissioned certain persecutions at certain times in certain places. So what I'm trying to say is, even though we mark these 4 persecutions, nobody should think for a moment that there weren't a lot of smaller ones in between them. And first you have Nero on this list in the year 64. His persecutions were not particularly widespread, but they were famous both for their sadism and for their very notable victims. Secondly, you have the Emperor Decius. That's the year 249 to 251. Decius embarked on what you might call a revival of paganism. And he started the first empire-wide persecution. During his persecution, the offering of incense to the image of the emperor was demanded. This would be a Roman, what they would consider it to be a political custom that we'll discuss just in a little bit. Then there was Valerian, 257 to 260. Under him, persecution was mostly economic and legal. Christians had their property confiscated and were denied the right to legally assemble for worship. Then you had Diocletian, 303 to 311. His reign saw Christians suffer the worst persecution of all. Churches were destroyed, Bibles burnt, all civil rights of Christians were suspended, and sacrifice to Roman gods was commanded. This was probably the worst persecution of all. Which is a very important thing. I want you to remember, this last persecution of Diocletian, 303 to 311, probably the worst one of all. Keep that in your mind because we're going to refer to it later. Now, why is it that Christians were mostly persecuted? Well, do you remember what we saw, that statement from Tacitus a while back? Why did he say that Christians in the days of Nero were persecuted? What was the phrase he used? Haters of mankind, right? You and I would say, listen, Christians are all about love, right? How could Christians be considered haters of mankind? Well, I'll tell you how they could be considered that. Because they did not participate in and approve